Good afternoon. I am Michael Kessler, Executive Director of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. On behalf of my colleagues at the Berkley Center, I welcome you to this panel discussion on the new book, The Vatican and Permanent Neutrality, edited by Marshall Breger and Herbert Reginbogin. In today's event, we will hear from a number of contributors to the volume who will consider the Vatican's stance of permanent neutrality and historical perspectives and contemporary implications of permanent neutrality, from the Holocaust and the Cold War to the current war in the Ukraine. I want to thank Professor Breger for the collaboration on bringing today's event to fruition. The event was originally conceived by he and our dear colleague, Father Drew Christensen, who passed away in April 2022. Today's discussion will touch on many issues which Drew held dear, and we are delighted to see so many colleagues from his networks participate in this event. It is now my pleasure to welcome Professor Marshall Breger of the Columbus School of Law at Catholic University of America, who will introduce and moderate today's discussion. Professor Breger.
Thanks so much. My name is Marshall Breger. I teach at the Catholic University Law School in Washington, and I'm happy to open this Zoom panel. The panel will focus on issues of permanent neutrality and just war related to the Holocaust, the Cold War, and the conflict in the Ukraine. It's based on a book that Herbert Reginbogin and I co-edited earlier this year. And I'm told it's a great stocking stuffer, but I leave that to others. Let me say first that my interest in this subject really grew from reading a clause in the 1993 Fundamental Agreement between Israel and the Holy See, to which the Holy See recognized the state of Israel and laid the framework for relations between the Holy See and Israel. The language is quite interesting. The Holy See declared itself, quote, a stranger to all merely temporal conflicts. This struck me as fascinating, since as a law professor, I'm used to international law language as prosaic and indeed boring. And here's a text that's redolent of poetry, a stranger to all merely temporal conflicts. They were clearly discussing the Israel-Palestine conflict, and they didn't want to take a stand on which side to favor, but it led me to thinking about Vatican ideas of neutrality, which led to a workshop at the Catholic University in 2021 with my colleague Herbert Reginbogin, and this led to the present book. Neutrality has had a long distinguished pedigree in the legal literature, in diplomatic practice, and in international law. The academics, the text writers like Grotius and Vattel in the 18th century and earlier wrote extensively about the idea of neutrality. There's extensive case law on maritime trade and neutrality. It includes questions such as what is a prize ship? When may you capture a neutral ship or a ship that claims to be neutral? What is the procedure to adjudicate whether it is a prize, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these are very important topics in the 18th and 19th century. And indeed, politically, there was increased interest in neutrality in the 19th century. The 1859 Hague peace process discussed neutrality. In 1907, the Hague Conference on the Role and Duties of Neutral Nations laid out more clearly in international law the legal position of neutrals. After World War I, the exhaustion of nations and of peoples led to an increased interest in neutrality. It also led to some confusion in terminology. Confusion, by the way, that exists today in some discussion of Vatican ideas on neutrality. The term as popularly used conflates three strands of thought. Isolationism, a view that flourished after the First War. And I must say, with the recent former president may have been resurrected today. A second is pacifism. And a third is what we talk about in this book, not taking sides. World War II saw the discussion of neutrality pretty much fall off the table. And that's because neutrality became associated with appeasement to National Socialism, and nobody wanted to be associated with that. But still, the concept serves the needs of international politics, and such a concept can't be denied, can't be hidden away. And after World War II, Austria, Finland, for a time, Switzerland, and even Turkmenistan all proclaim themselves neutral. And even today, with Finland and Sweden voting to enter NATO, the concept still has political currency. But we're not here to talk about neutrality in international law. We're here to talk about Vatican ideas of neutrality. Through the 18th century, Vatican was a player in European politics. It controlled the Papal States, and so it couldn't be neutral in that temporal sense. And it was actively involved in alliances, the shifting alliances of the great powers. But still, after the Congress of Vienna and the Restoration, the Vatican began to state that it was neutral. In 1821, in the so-called Neapolitan crisis, Cardinal Eccole Consalvi stated, the Holy Father will maintain a, quote, perfect neutrality to all nations. This continued in the French Revolution, in the Revolution of 1848, and even in the First World War, where the 1917 papal peace note, Pope Benedict XV explicitly opted for neutrality. It is for every thinking man abundantly clear in this frightful conflict that the Holy See will be increasingly watching it with the closest attention and must preserve the most absolute neutrality. World War II, the same. In the 1943 encyclical, Mysticae Corpus Christi, it's pointed out in admittedly abstract language that Catholics look to, quote, the Vicar of Jesus Christ as to the loving Father of them all, who with absolute neutrality, quote, takes up the cause of peace. There's a tension between neutrality and impartiality, between absolute neutrality and absolute impartiality. And it's going to continue through the rest of the book and through the issues we're discussing today. Bolshevism, where the Vatican admittedly at the beginning seemed prepared to engage with the Bolsheviks through the late 20s, but of course at the same time developed a almost Manichaean anti-Bolshevik position, and as Piotr Konsicki will point out, took the position of no neutrality in ideology. The issues of the neutrality in the Holocaust have been well debated. We have new information from the opening of the Vatican archives. Suzanne Brown Fleming has made initial forays into these archives, and she will discuss some issues of the Vatican neutrality in the Shoah today. The conflict in the Ukraine began after we sent the book to press, but the issues are still relevant, and I'm glad that we'll have a panel that will raise those issues as well. In back of all of this discussion is the relationship between power and spirituality, between what things belong to Caesar and what things belong to God. And Herbert Reginbogin will open our discussion by raising that topic. He is a collegiate fellow at the Institute for Policy Research at the Catholic University of America, and has taught in universities in Turkey and in Germany, including the University of Potsdam and the University of Kiel. I'm pleased to hand the Zoom podium over to him. Thank you.
Thank you, Marshall, for the introduction. The book considers the ineluctable tension between pastoral teachings and realpolitik, or better said, power and spirituality. As the church faces reckoning with its history over these 150 years, some of the cases that are illuminated are not the highlights of church history, but they do give us a contrast of what is a realistic journey between 1870 and today. 1870, the time when the Vatican or Papal State no longer existed because it had no more territory. But yet it continued what is referred to as an international personality without real estate. Why? Because the sovereigns of the major great powers in the 19th century and into the 20th century called upon the Pope to be a mediator of conflicts. He was a symbol. He was an agent for mediation, for peace. And so this tradition continued in its humanitarianism, even in World War I. And yet, as this continued, it also brought about a competition between the secular world and the religious world, as personified between the competition between international law and canon law. For it was canon law that was reorganized at the turn of the 20th century and then applied as it would be applied in the area of international law. And then as this continued into the 20th century, the Vatican became a quasi-state. It adopted statehood through the Vatican Accords, an agreement between Italy's leader Mussolini and Pius XI. What this change in this international personality impacted with a dual personality. A dual personality that on the one hand, it represented the statehood, and then at the same time, an international organization. And how did this dichotomy of personality affect the future in the issues and the cases that are not the highlights of church history? And they are the following: the century-long worldwide cruelties of child abuse, and the financial corruption. And then lastly, the Vatican unwillingness to seek justice of the historical past by opening archives at the beginning of the 21st century, which is now Pius XII's archives. Now is opened as of 2 years approximately. These cases are illustrations of what has been attempted to avoid decisions of putting the perpetrators in the court of justice. That court of justice is either under canon law or under international law. But it has used a practice since 1922 of putting such cases under pontifical secrecy, which means if anyone were to talk about this situation of molestation, they would be immediately excommunicated. There was no appeals of any sort. This was a very strict codex. This was revised in 1983, this codex, but its practice wasn't really ushered into practice until Pope Francis in 2021 began to defrock cardinals and actually change canon law. And in this situation, the book attempts to show the contrasts about the imperfection of justice. And as we'll be hearing more about justice and injustice, or about good and bad, there is a world of scripture that is calling for more inclusiveness. The question really arises, does the binary that has been used in so many centuries of just and unjust not contrast with the neutrality, the permanent neutrality, the statecraft that was adopted by the Vatican and also practiced when it was not a permanent neutral, but as a mediator of engaging both sides for peace. So the question arises, instead of putting something in one box or another, the inclusiveness of the other, the human dignity of the human, is an utmost scriptural aim that is reflected by Pope Francis. Do we not need to go beyond these binary categorizations and understand what is the role, what is the meaning of permanent neutrality? This does not remove condemnation. It sets that very clear. But you can be a mediator of looking at both sides in greater depths and with greater sensitivity and inclusiveness. And the question is not one of associating generalities of democracy versus authoritarianism, or again, all the different political scientific rhetoric that one tries to explain a phenomena in those ideas of just and unjust, but instead of looking for inclusion of the others, for the unity and for the dignity of mankind. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Suzanne Brown Fleming. She is director of the International Academic Programs at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Our first book, The Holocaust and Catholic Conscience, Cardinal Aloysius Munch and the Guilt Question in Germany, was received to rave reviews. She is presently working on a study of Eugenio Pacelli in Germany, a study of Pacelli's relationship to Germany during the Third Reich. As I mentioned earlier, she's started to put her toes into the Vatican archives and was pushed back by the pandemic. I think she made a new run at it. So hopefully she will have some information from the archives to give us as well. I'm delighted to hand the microphone to Suzanne Brown Fleming to speak on permanent neutrality and the Holocaust. Thank you.
There we go. Hi, everyone. Am I unmuted? Everyone can hear me? Good, excellent. I want to also give a brief shout out to the Center for Jewish Civilization in Georgetown. I do teach there as well. So I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that. As my colleagues have noted, the Vatican archives for the period of Pope Pius XII, that means from 1939 to 1958, were opened in March of 2020, and scholars from around the world have been busily digging since about June of 2020, when the pandemic allowed researchers to go in again. We're talking about roughly 16 million documents. That's just an estimate. So one can understand that of the many important questions, it's going to take us years, if not decades, to really go through everything. And one of the most burning questions has been the role of Pope Pius XII. That's one of the first things that people are looking for. And as Marshall and Herbert mentioned already, Pius XII did follow a policy of neutrality and impartiality during World War II. And I think it's interesting, and something that I learned more about in writing my part of this book is that this was not a new phenomenon. That's Marshall and Herbert have mentioned this already, but as early as the Napoleonic Wars in the 19th century and World War I, this was already a fraught issue for the Catholic Church. In the case of the Napoleonic Wars, Pius VII mentioned that he would not align the Papal States with Napoleonic France, and this was a heated issue at the time. And in a more contemporary example for Pope Benedict XV during World War I, he actually sought to play a role as mediator, declaring himself as impartial without preconception or judgment. And what he hoped, Benedict XV, was that this approach would actually earn them the trust of both sides. But instead, and we see echoes of this as well in World War II history, what it actually did was provoke suspicion, because he couldn't, as an impartial actor, and Benedict XV wouldn't name specific atrocities. So the echoes of this we see when we're talking about World War II, that this critique that already was something we heard in World War I, that if by Pope Benedict being, quote, silent, which is a loaded word in these contexts, that he actually compromise the church and weaken the faith by not being specific. So this is a charge we saw before the World War II history. Marshall and Herbert also mentioned that as the loss of temporal power was something of great concern to Popes Pius XI and XII, and really a relatively new phenomenon, both popes were very interested in protecting the rights of the church and church life, sacraments, property, buildings, ability to give the sacraments, etc., and pursued a series of concordats or papal agreements with various states to ensure Catholic rights. Now, it didn't matter what kind of state it was necessarily. Concordats were concluded with authoritarian, democratic, socialist, and fascist regimes alike. So that is the context walking into the Holocaust. And what I found really interesting and engaging in the archives, I'll bring up two examples of two kinds of documents that I've been seeing. One is this tension that Herbert mentioned between the Pope as a spiritual leader and the Pope as head of a city-state was something that Catholics at the time and immediately after the war were already very torn about, already writing into the Vatican about, already offering interpretations and critiques about. There are some really fascinating letters, some encouraging of papal policy, some very critical of papal policy by Catholics themselves who were trying to navigate their own way through this period. And I think that's something that could be a really interesting study. One letter that I examined in this book was from a former communist named Maria Sevenich, who was extremely critical of Pius XII because she believed that he should have chosen the part of the moral voice of the church rather than protection of the church. But there are many more letters like that in the collection. The other issue that I've been looking at in the newly released archives is that of the clemency campaign for Catholic and Axis war criminals after 1945. Most of you have probably heard about, let me check my time, okay, 2 more minutes. Have heard about the Nuremberg trials and the successor trials. The Vatican intervened very vigorously for mercy and clemency for war criminals. And it's something Herbert calls indiscriminate mercy in the book. And it's a fascinating concept and context, because on the one hand, the principle of love and mercy for even the worst of war criminals, which was the public face of this campaign, had what I would call a darker underside of equations of revenge with the Old Testament, with Mosaic law. And there we can ask some questions about whether and how anti-Semitism became rejected in the mid-1960s, despite these kinds of lingering stereotypes. So let me leave it at that until the Q&A, and I hope that was a little bit clearer, at least a little stimulating, and I'm happy to pass the baton.
Thank you, Suzanne. Our next speaker is Piotr Kosicki, Associate Professor of History at the University of Maryland. He has studied the question of the church in Eastern Europe at length. He has written Catholics on the Barricade, 1891 to 1956, Christian Democracy Across the Iron Curtain, Christian Democracy and the Fall of Communism, and Vatican II, Behind the Iron Curtain. And I think he's the best place we have to talk about Vatican, concepts of neutrality, and Bolshevism after World War I and during the Cold War. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marshall. Thank you again to Marshall and to Herbert for starting this wonderful venture, and to the Berkley Center for hosting this this important discussion. I have to say that I really enjoyed reading the book in its entirety once I received the copy. I found that there's actually an incredibly eclectic assortment of approaches to permanent neutrality in the book. And it's something we can't possibly do justice in a panel like this, but I did want to underscore that, because my own understanding of the concept changed completely in the course of correspondence with Herbert and with Marshall while I was working on and revising the chapter. I want to be clear about two things from the outset when I talk about the Cold War and permanent neutrality. And this connects to the very different phases of neutrality that Marshall described in his opening remarks, which is that it seems like an oxymoron on some level, sort of at face value, to think about the Cold War and the Vatican stance in it as neutral, for the simple reason that the Vatican was more or less, or the Holy See, I should say, was more or less consistently ideologically and publicly ideologically opposed to Bolshevism from the get-go. Now, we know from work in the Vatican archives done, for example, by a colleague of mine who teaches at the University of Wisconsin, Juliana Chambriz, about the 1920s and 1930s, that actually the reality was more complex, that the Holy See developed its more firmly, fully articulated anti-Bolshevik stance in fits and spurts. But whether we think about the Cold War as starting in 1948 or in 1945 or even in 1917, the immediate assumption is that there's no way that the Holy See could possibly have been neutral. There's no way we could really think in holistic terms about neutrality in the context of the Cold War. And I found that that's just not the case at all, that there's a crucial distinction. This is something on which I really found Herbert's earlier work to be very enlightening for me, to distinguish between moral and spiritual neutrality on the one hand, and political and legal neutrality on the other hand. And I think that the moral and the spiritual, this goes right back to Article 24 of the Lateran Accords, which after all, as I think is textually, if we think in terms of the actual historical source work, is the glue that has to hold together this particular conversation. On the one hand, in Article 24, we see neutrality in the international order. On the other hand, we see the Vatican, the Holy See, reserving to itself the place to inveigh and declare and take positions, the imperative even, moral and spiritual positions. And this is what we see throughout the Cold War. Obviously, it's very difficult to generalize with one broad stroke from Pius XII, so famous for the phrase Church of Silence, so public in his excommunications of various prominent and rising communist authorities behind the emerging Iron Curtain, right? So Pius XII, of course, the Pope of the years of the Holocaust, but also the Pope of the years of the establishment of the Iron Curtain and of communist regimes across what would become the Soviet bloc. So Pius XII, famously in the case of the Hungarian primate Cardinal Joseph Mindszenty, issues excommunications of everyone involved in the show trial, the arrest, the interrogations, the torture of Joseph Mindszenty. And there's a series of public outcries and public campaigns, and I would say propaganda campaigns, that really make clear that there was no ideological neutrality, and there couldn't be ideological neutrality in the early years of the Cold War. But by the same token, that this did not actually cross over into infringement upon the Holy See's legal neutrality. And this is something Pope Pius XII himself has stated explicitly in 1951. Of course, we can say, well, he has to make that kind of a declaration, paying lip service to the commitments articulated in the Lateran Accords. But frankly, it was in Pope Pius XII's interest to maintain these kinds of separate spheres. Whether we look at the political history as it evolved on both sides of the Iron Curtain, not wanting to weigh in a way that would make it impossible for Catholics to practice their faith behind the Iron Curtain, to call for bearing witness to the Church of Silence, to repressions against Catholic figures behind the Iron Curtain was one thing, but wholesale blanket excommunications become tricky when you have Catholic populations that one way or another have to abide by civil law in newly established regimes in the late 1940s and early 1950s. So the precedent that's set, even though the public faces one of unflailing condemnation, is not to get involved at the level of states and international law. And this kind of legal neutrality, the persistence of legal neutrality, allows for secular figures, certainly in Western Europe, for example, the rising political parties of the family known as Christian democracy, but behind the Iron Curtain as well, different kinds of experiments that are attempting to preserve pastoral space behind the Iron Curtain. And that kind of pastoral action, when we talk about excommunications, it's really a pastoral action under canon law, inveighing against individuals and limiting the ability of individuals to continue to participate in the faith, as opposed to incursion into individual state law. Now, how do we think about the transition from Pius XII to John the 23rd, following Pius XII's death in 1958, the calling of the Second Vatican Council, the spirit of aggiornamento, and indeed the attempts at normalization, diplomatic normalization with a variety of states? I talk about this at length in my chapter. I did want to say a couple of words just to underscore one thing, which is what seems at face value again to be a complete caesura in this transition from Pius XII to John the 23rd. I see certain continuities. It wasn't Pius XII who abrogated concordats with newly established people's republics behind the Iron Curtain. It was the people's republics that abrogated concordats. So the idea of pursuing normalization, particularly after the death of John the 23rd, when Paul VI, who after all had been personally quite close to Pope Pius XII, came to power, was in some sense a restoration of continuity, a restoration of legal regimes that had already been put into place under Pius XI, and in which Eugenio Pacelli, as Pius XI's diplomat, had been quite closely involved. So normalization, whether pursued with Yugoslavia, pursued with Hungary, pursued with Poland, always the most complicated case. I see this amply in my own research. I would like to say that it's quite complex when German bishops are actually in principle apostolic, have the apostolic charge over sovereign post-war sovereign Polish territory, but that notion of sovereignty is itself incredibly complex. Likewise, the fact that there was an exiled Polish government in London whose Vatican ambassador was more honored until the death of Pius XII, and in fact kind of retained a vague plenipotentiary status into the 1970s. And yet, even with the unique and some sui generis status of the different states, we see a continuity in place in terms of legal neutrality throughout the Cold War that meets maybe its ultimate test with the election of someone holding a passport of the People's Republic of Poland to the papacy in 1978. How does one preserve legal neutrality in the context of the Holy See when the head of state of the Holy See holds a passport of an Iron Curtain country? It's a very interesting intellectual conundrum. And in practical legal terms, what it meant was that the John Paul II really continued or resurrected some of the lines originally delivered by Pius XII. On the one hand, firm, uncompromising ideological and spiritual opposition, firm public campaigning, and taking it into the field, going back to the People's Republic of Poland, using that passport, using his citizenship to confront with political dilemmas while maintaining legal neutrality, and sometimes even reining in Ronald Reagan and other Western leaders on that particular score. So if we look to the end of the Cold War, I really see a story of continuity, which is not one that I necessarily would have expected when I first started thinking synoptically about the Cold War in terms of Vatican permanent neutrality. I did want to say, and I don't know, I want to cross over in the subject matter of the next panel, but by way of closing in my final minute or so, that thinking about the rhetoric of a new Cold War, or Cold War II, Neil Ferguson has called it, in the context of the larger global ramifications of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, to me, I think poses certain challenges. And I mean, I've loved everything Massimo Fagioli has written on this, so I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say. But specifically, in a way that I think that the old ability of the Holy See to toe the line and juggle ideological non-neutrality and legal neutrality from the longer Cold War no longer applies. And I think that this imperative to pursue peace really needs to be clarified and needs to be spelled out. And the Holy See has its work cut out for it now. Thank you.
Thank you. While we wait, if there are questions from the audience, let me start and ask Piotr and also Suzanne. If you have an ideological opposition, doesn't that mean ultimately regime change? And if you have regime change, doesn't that mean a rejection of legal neutrality, if not personal neutrality? This may be a bigger issue for Piotr, who talks about ideological opposition, than Suzanne, who talks about spiritual opposition, but I'll ask the question to both.
Can you clarify what you mean? Are you?
What I mean is that the traditional notion is temporal neutrality, legal neutrality, don't want to change the state, opposition to the activities of the state, either spiritual or ideological. So my question is that at least with certain regimes, National Socialism, Bolshevism, spiritual opposition, ideological opposition will ultimately leads to regime change, which means to no legal neutrality. So are these distinctions really supportable?
Well, I think it comes back to the fact that we're talking about this dual entity. We're talking, the Holy See is a temporal entity. It's a city-state with the interests of any city-state, but it's also the head of more than 1 billion Catholics around the world who are thinking more about its teachings. I think that's impossible to square. It's always been impossible to square in church history. It always will be impossible. to square. And I think that it's what Piotr said about one consideration in the mind of both popes was opposition to another head of state can mean that Catholics don't have access to what they need to be Catholic. They don't have access to Mass, they don't have access to the sacraments, they don't have access to confession or a Catholic burial. So it really was a dilemma on a number of levels. And it came down to the question of, who do you take care of? Do you take care of your own? Do you do the best you can for your flock, for Catholics, or do you take a more universal stance for the dignity of all human beings, whatever that might mean, even for Catholics? So it's an impossible situation, and I think what we're going to find in the archives, and what I have been finding, is that it was an impossible situation. And what becomes interesting is how people thought about it at the lay level, at the level of the hierarchy, at the level of the Pope and his two top officers, Tardini and Montini, and what the debates looked like around it.
Yoda?
Yeah, this is a terrific question. I mean, it's thorniest for Pius XII, I think. But the example I gave of Mincenti show trial, which in the early years of the Cold War was really one of the most telling ones. The fact that Pius XII's response was A, public propaganda campaign, B, individual excommunications, right? So individual excommunications that's not the same thing as calling for regime change. Now, in his heart of hearts, did he want regime change? I'm pretty sure he did. But that's, again, in terms of the actual stance taken publicly and in terms of the official formal stance, I see a big difference. John Paul II, we could have a similar conversation, but legally he was also a Polish dissident. And this duality of being a citizen of the People's Republic of Poland and coming from Poland and actually being, in some sense, literally a Soviet bloc dissident in charge of the Holy See, I think is putting him in a very different situation. And he was also very fine-grained, I think, in terms of how he handled himself, especially when he was on the ground in Eastern Europe, where, in some sense, you could read everything he said as a call for regime change, but it was never stated explicitly. And obviously, depends how high or low you want to set the bar, but I think that's exactly where we are. The distinction is between things that were said, the public campaign that was waged, and the legal steps that were taken. I see them as two different fields.
Thank you. One important...
I do want to just add one sentence about this excommunication issue, because it's fascinating. This is not a step that Pius XII took with regard to any of German war criminals. And so I've not come across any documentation about discussions around this, but I do think it's an interesting contrast, and maybe there'll be something that pops up in the archives in the future.
We have two audience questions. I'm going to put them together, and in our remaining 4 minutes, see what we can do. Question: to what extent did the Vatican's assessment of who was likely to prevail in the two world wars, and to perhaps a lesser extent in the Cold War, affect Vatican policy? Second, do you think the Vatican ideological silence about the US invasion of Iraq, hiding behind a fake wall of political neutrality so as not to challenge the US? I'll just point out that we have a chapter in the book about neutrality and Iraq invasions. Two invasions, they take a somewhat different view than the questionnaire, but we leave it now to the panelists. Who's on first?
I'll jump in. I'll try to be only 1 minute so that I give my colleague his 1 minute as well. Of course, the Pope was carefully watching who's going to win the war. And of course, he was calculating what that would mean for Catholics and how he could best position protecting the Catholic Church, which meant his positions or some of his tactics, not necessarily his positions, but some of his tactics would change through the course of the war. That's a short answer, but I'll pass the baton.
Yeah, so the short answer I would give is that the specifics differ from pope to pope, but the short answer is also, of course. John the 23rd, I will underscore, was really brought in a sea change in terms of his concern about the threat of nuclear annihilation. And that's something that I think really does need to be underscored as well in terms of the globalizing effects of what it means to win the war and the consideration for peace as the bottom line for legal neutrality. So
if I could just point out that we have 2 chapters in the book about nuclear weapons and neutrality. Herbert, you have 30 seconds.
Well, there's an old saying, you put your money where you believe the future will be. And the head of the Vatican Bank moved almost all of its assets into US stocks and treasury bills. So if anyone wants to know how the Vatican believed about the outcome of World War II, I would refer to that fact. And if you're putting so much of your assets into that dollar denomination, because there's only two currencies, Swiss franc and the dollar, that is internationally recognized by all the parties, belligerents and neutrals. And if going to post-Cold War security, that's another issue about how the framing of these 2 ideas of just and unjust, this is post-Cold War security. This is where total war, where there is not good and bad, evil, it's about the circumstances. And that is the most important understanding of how we talk about inclusiveness and living together in a new world of total war and total peace. Thank you.
Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, our book was sent to the publisher almost immediately before the Russian invasion or special administrative action, as they called it, something like that. So it's not really discussed in the book, but the basic principles raised by neutrality, raised by just war, are very relevant to a discussion of the present situation in the Ukraine. And I'm delighted to hand the gavel, so to speak, over to the Rev David Hollenbeck of Georgetown University. Anyone in this field knows his work and knows his activity in theology and ethics. And he will moderate the panel on just war, neutrality, and the Ukraine. Reverend Hollenbeck.
Thank you very much, Marshall. I'm very grateful to be with all of you. Excuse me, I have a frog in my throat. Hope you can hear me better now. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be part of this discussion. I think that the discussion we're going to have is very much in continuity with some of the earlier discussions that are treated in the book by Marshall Breger and Herbert Reginbogin on the role of the Vatican in relationship to the contemporary political scene in Ukraine today. It's very much in continuity with some of these earlier issues. We're going to focus on the Ukraine situation and just war tradition, which is a long-standing tradition within the Roman Catholic community, going back to Augustine and Aquinas, and how that relates to neutrality. The Holy See's 1929 Lateran Pact with Italy specified, quote, "The Holy See declares that it desires to take and shall take no part in any temporal rivalries between other states." So this is the neutrality affirmation from the Lateran Pact. But it goes on in the Lateran Pact to specify an exception to this. Actually, it specifies 2 exceptions, but one of the exceptions is, but the Holy See reserves the right of exercising its moral and spiritual power. Now, these two things can clearly come into conflict with each other, as Professor Kosicki has indicated, the tension between the kind of legal neutrality between states and the moral position about conflicts and harm to human beings in terms of their fundamental dignity in war and so forth. So it raises the question for us today regarding the Ukraine situation. The issue has emerged there in debates about the appropriateness of the Pope Francis's evolving position on the war in Ukraine. Initially, Pope Francis tried to be remaining rather neutral between the West and Russia, wanting to keep kind of open ecumenical relationships with the Russian Orthodox Church, trying to keep open the possibility that he could serve some kind of mediating role in advancing peace between the West and Russia. But more recently, just over the last couple of months, his position has evolved. And very recently, in an interview that was published in America Magazine just about a week ago, he took a very strong position criticizing the Russians for what has been happening in Ukraine. A few weeks before that, he compared it to the Holocaust of Stalin's starvation of large numbers of people in Ukraine. And so he's been much more critical of Russia in very recent weeks than he was early in the war. And this has led to a retaliatory critique by Russia against the Vatican and the Holy See just much more recently than that. And so this opens the question for us of how do you keep this neutrality, which the Vatican has long sought, together with the commitment to certain fundamental moral values and what Professor Reginbogin calls spiritual values, or what Professor Kosicki has called the moral commitments of the Holy See. How do you keep neutral on one level, the political or legal level, and how do you take a strong stand on the moral and spiritual level? These are very important issues. We will have a panel now to discuss these questions in light of the Church's moral teachings and its relation to history. I would just highlight that our four speakers are Dr. Massimo Fagioli, who's a professor of historical theology at Villanova University, Dr. Marianne Cusimano Love, who is professor of politics at the Catholic University of America, Dr. Professor Tobias Winwright, who is professor of theological ethics at St. Patrick's Pontifical University in Maynooth, Ireland, and Professor Matthew Shadle, who is a professor of theology at Marymount University in Virginia. So we will turn it over now to the four of them, and I would invite initially Professor Fagioli to start us off with a consideration of these issues. Massimo?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, David, for the introduction. In the very few minutes I have, I will do two things. One, to start and attempt a periodization of what has happened in these last 9 months since the invasion, and second, raise some questions that the war in Ukraine poses to those who want to understand the issue of Vatican neutrality. From an historical point of view, it's very clear the activism of Pope Francis personally since the invasion of February 24th, 2022, just a few hours after the beginning of the war, paying a visit to the Russian ambassador to the Holy See, an adjustment of the liturgy of Good Friday and appeals letters. I think that what what's most important is to see that the development that Hollenbeck was referring to takes place at the end of the summer, at the beginning of the fall, because we have a previous period when it is still possible for the Patriarchate of Moscow to manipulate Pope Francis' words and to say in strange ways that actually Pope Francis understands our issues, our motives. That has lasted until the summer, and after the failed attempts to arrange a meeting between Pope Francis and Patriarch Kirill, first in Jerusalem and then in Kazakhstan. These two meetings are canceled for various reasons, but also for the persistence of the war that made that meeting impossible. And then something happens at the end of the summer, also because it is clear that there's a real danger of a nuclear escalation of the war. One of the very, it's the first time or second that Pope Francis at the Angelus of October the 2nd skips completely the comment of the gospel of the day and makes a direct plea to the president of the Russian Federation and of Ukraine, asking them to de-escalate and to stop this. So we see that since September, October, there is a shift, and Russia no longer tries to say Pope Francis actually is on our side. There, as it has been said before, the latest is the reaction against the interview that Pope Francis gave to American magazine, and that was published at the end of November. Now, there are a few issues very telegraphically that are raised by the war in Ukraine for the Vatican stance. First, what it means to be neutral or to maintain neutrality in a hyper-mediatized papacy, hyper-mediatic papacy, where diplomacy is no longer the major channel of communication. Second, there's a problem, I believe, in the relationship between Pope Francis and the Secretary of State, which makes the whole situation more complicated because it's not clear if they are on the same page, I think, or if there are different views that have tensions in the way they are articulated. Third, the Vatican stance, now it is more complicated because it's no longer a diplomatic tradition that is in the hands of the Italian and the French, basically, as it has been for a long time. But it's a global Catholicism and a global Vatican, where there are incredibly divergent views of Russia, of the United States. That is kind of new. It is new, at least in the publicity that these voices have. And finally, I believe that we are in a post-Cold War. It's not a new Cold War. I believe that the Cold War guaranteed a certain stability. And I don't think that we can comfort ourselves in thinking that we are in a new Cold War situation. I believe that it is more complicated because what was typical of the Cold War was this pair of the bipolar world and a quite solid, stable, ecumenical intra-church relations. Now those both two are in shattered, in tatters, and I think this is much more complicated than it was during the Cold War. I'll stop here. Thank you very much. I'll be interested in following the next presentations. Thanks.
So we turn it over now to Professor Marianne Cusimano-Love from Catholic University to give us some political comments. Marianne?
Thanks, David. As Putin threatens nuclear war in Ukraine and the risks of nuclear weapons use and radiological explosions and accidents are higher than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's an important time to look at what the Church's position is on nuclear weapons and where it's been on this issue. So my chapter for the book is The Church and the Bomb: Holy See Diplomacy and Nuclear Weapons. It stems out of my recent book, Global Issues Beyond Sovereignty, as well as my forthcoming book on nuclear weapons and on religious actors, God and the Bomb. I want to make three points in looking at this. One is that the Church is not a non-state actor. It is a pre-state actor. And this is really important to understand the Holy See's position towards sovereignty and towards neutrality. So the Holy See existed long before the modern sovereign state system, 16 centuries before it, and has existed with lots of different types of political systems, and still does have relationships with lots of different types of political systems. So that's really important to understand. And it has these vast transnational networks, these vast organizations that often do things that we associate with states, and has done these things long before the existence of the sovereign state system. One thing to point out, we often talk about the sovereign state system as if it came about the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. That's nice shorthand for international relations, but it's not really true. There's only about 7 states from Westphalia that are with us today, and 3/4 of the sovereign state system, sovereign states and the 193 sovereign states that exist today came about after the Second World War. So the sovereign state system is extremely new. The Catholic Church is extremely old, and the networks of the Church are very old. So that's important to understand. The second is that the Catholic Church is not a national church. This is really important compared to other churches that are much more nationally limited. So that means the Church's 1.3 billion Catholics are distributed across all the countries. And that means that for the Church, the skills of engagement, the skills of dialogue, the skills that I discuss in my work on just peace, building right relationships, expanding dialogue and participation, those are not niceties, nice to have. These are not only moral principles, but they're skills that the Church has had to build over centuries, because as an institution, we are made up of people from all these various national and ethnic backgrounds. And so the skills that the Church has developed in building relationships, in discussion and dialogue, and mediating across these identity lines are skills that we need internally within the Church, and that they also provide a very important skill set internationally to international relations. So that position that the Holy See has had as an international mediator. So understanding that the Church is a pre-state actor, that it's not a national church, helps you understand that it's very different from other neutral states. It is the world's smallest sovereign state and the world's largest nation at the same time. And that means, with regard to nuclear weapons, that it has a foot both in the world of sovereign states and the world of these transnational non-sovereign and non-state actors, but also that it has a foot in both the nuclear weapons states and the non-nuclear weapons states. So the term, the Pope is the bridge builder, and we can see that to literally be true in the field of nuclear weapons. There's not another actor out there that has the networks and the relationships between both the nuclear weapons states and the non-nuclear weapons states. So the third point I want to raise is that the Church is not at all neutral regarding nuclear weapons. Before nuclear weapons were ever developed, the Holy See was arguing against their development. When the weapons were developed, the Catholic Church was decimated in Nagasaki. They were the recipients of those weapons. That was the seat of the largest group of Catholics of the Catholic Church in all of Asia. So the Catholic Church has very consistently been a voice against nuclear weapons and in favor of nuclear disarmament. That has been a constant stream, whether it was through the development of the world's first nuclear weapons-free zones, the de-escalation of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I discuss in the chapter, the development of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, And finally, most recently, the creation of the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons, of which I participated with the Holy See Mission at the United Nations. I'm a consultant to the Holy See Mission at the United Nations and work with them both on the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons as well as the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. So I, similar to Piotr and previous speakers, see a great deal of continuity in Holy See position regarding nuclear weapons. Happy to discuss their statements on deterrence more in the Q&A. But just to remind us that the Pope Francis is maybe the first Pope from the Global South, but he will not be the last. Because of these changes in demographics, 2/3 of the Catholic Church is now in the Global South. That's a total flip-flop from a century ago when 2/3 of the Catholic Church lived in the Global North. And so that definitely affects the Church's position and views on nuclear weapons. And as was seen, when the Church was bringing in the victims of nuclear weapons to speak at these arms control treaties, which had not been done before, and really changed the tenor and the outcome of those negotiations. So the Church is not only interested in moving nuclear weapons policy, but also in changing the moral framework by which we view these policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marianne. It's very good to hear this overview on the Vatican's policy on nuclear weapons, which is clearly relevant to the current conflict where the danger of nuclear war has escalated very notably, as you highlight. Now we will turn to Professor Tobias Winwright from St. Patrick's Pontifical University in Ireland, who will speak to us from his point of view. Tobias?
Thank you, Father Hollenbeck. Thank you, everyone else, too, for joining us and for being a part of this event. I did not contribute to the book, but I read it, and I found it to be very, very interesting. I'm going to touch on the tension that's been highlighted between the moral and spiritual versus the legal as well, like Father Hollenbeck said. And some of the authors to this volume noted, such as Maria de Avianzo, she talked about the relationship between just war on the one hand and the Holy See's neutrality on the other hand. And and Suzanne Fleming earlier, she talked about this as well. She had a section on neutrality as moral failure. And this letter from 1945 by Maria Sevinich, I found to be very interesting because with the war in Ukraine, as Massimo identified and highlighted very well, there's been kind of an evolution of Pope Francis's statements and remarks about that war. And for the first several months, I heard from many on this over here in Europe that including here where I am right now, there are many Ukrainians here in Ireland right now. And you know, the Pope was speaking out kind of in a neutral way for both sides. And it's kind of a moral position. It's not just a Vatican self-interested thing. I mean, going back to Pius IX, he did say that the Holy See embraces all races, peoples, and nations with an equal devotion and paternal love. So there's a moral basis for this kind of impartiality and neutrality. However, some Ukrainians were saying, well, are we not justified in our armed defense of ourselves? And that's related to recent developments in Vatican and papal thinking about nonviolence and just peace. With such there was a curiosity, like was said earlier, about the definitions of neutrality. One of the assumptions is that that means pacifism. And so with the Pope's recent emphasis on nonviolence, there's been concern that pastorally speaking and morally speaking, we lack the language to help Ukrainians know whether or not they were doing the right thing, both using nonviolence to defend themselves, and they have been. There's many examples of that, but also as a both and, not an either or, the use of armed force to defend themselves. And this has been a concern, I think, that lasted several months. And just as Massimo pointed out, only in recent months, since September, has the Pope said, including this article from America Magazine last week, the interview, he indicated that the Ukrainians are well, in fact, he said that Ukrainian people are being martyred. Certainly the one who invades is the Russian state. This is very clear. Sometimes I try not to be specific so as not to offend, rather than and instead generally condemns. But he does say clearly to the Ukrainian young adults, for example, he lauded their courage defending their homeland and lamented that they had to postpone their dreams because they had to put their hands on weapons to defend themselves. So this kind of language is finally coming out. And I would just, the tension though, is still there. And the Vatican allegedly was the victim of internet attack on its website from Russia, perhaps because of this interview. Now, on another hand, I would just point out that the tension, it goes back a ways. We've mentioned 1870 earlier, and as a pivotal time, and the Vatican Council, First Vatican Council, actually had on its agenda a proposal that was approved by many, many bishops, over 40, to have on its agenda that the Vatican would have an entity that would use just war theory to adjudicate between nations which side is just and which side is unjust as they were about to embark on war. And the person that proposed this was an Anglican Scotsman named David Urquhart. And I was kind of surprised that there was no mention of this in the book, that he thought that the just war tradition as developed by the Catholic Church was a moral instrument that could be used to help Catholics, wherever they are, whatever country they are in, to inform their consciences and to know when to say no to a war and to refuse to serve in an unjust war. And this was something that Pius IX assured Urquhart of his support for this project, and it was accepted on the agenda. However, the council was never able to get to it because of the breaking out of the Franco-Prussian War. And so I'm just wondering, what if that had made the agenda? I mean, we could do a lot with what ifs, but how would that have affected the the neutrality? How could that be held in tandem with that? That would have been a very difficult thing to do, just as it is now, but it would have probably kept the just war thing, reasoning and framework more in tandem with it throughout. And then the other thing I would note that Pius XII in 1956, 1957, he said some things that were pretty amazing and contrast a lot with Pope Francis until recently. In 1956, he wrote, "There are rulers who accept themselves from the elementary laws of society." And he said that there is no further room for doubt about the purposes and methods that lie behind tanks when they crash resoundingly across frontiers to distribute death and to force civilized people to form of life that they distinctly abhor. When all possible stages of negotiation and mediation are bypassed, and when the threat is made to use atomic arms to obtain concrete demands, it becomes clear that in present circumstances, there may come into existence in a nation a situation in which all hope of averting war becomes vain. In this situation, a war of efficacious self-defense against unjust attacks, when it is undertaken with a hope of success, cannot be considered illicit. That's a pretty clear statement using just war principles, condemning what Russia was doing, the Soviet Union at the time in Hungary. And the absence of that in this book, again, there's this tension throughout, and I would welcome more discussion on that because I think it really is relevant for what's going on in Ukraine today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tobias. And so thank you. That was a very provocative quote you have right there at the end of your presentation. So I turn it over now to Matthew Shadle from Loyola University, from Marymount University, and welcome you, Matthew. And please share with us your comments.
Sure. Thank you for having me, and thanks for all the participants. So we've heard from Suzanne Brown Fleming about some of the dilemmas faced by Pope Pius XII during World War II, and he had this vision of papal diplomacy as the church kind of existing above the world of politics, and he even speaks that way sometimes. But then this led him to hesitate over taking clear moral stands during the war, most notoriously regarding the Holocaust. And so his goal was to maintain the church's witness to moral truth, but that ended up being muddied more than being kept pure. So in his essay in the volume that we're talking about, Massimo Fagioli points out that Pope Francis and his Secretary of State, Pietro Parolin, have adopted what they call positive neutrality. So instead of seeing the church floating above the world, they see the church as accompanying the world's peoples in the pursuit of peace. And so I think this down-to-earth approach is a better ecclesiology than Pius XII's. But the example of the war in Ukraine suggests that Francis has not yet figured out how to overcome the moral conundrums that come with neutrality. So I'm going to talk along similar lines to Tobias, but focus more on what Pope Francis has said about the origins of the war, and that leading into the just war tradition. So Pope Francis has condemned Russia's aggression and maintained Ukrainians' right to self-defense, but at least until September, when he first, called out Russia by name, he had followed Vatican diplomatic practice and refused to name the aggressors in his condemnations. And as Tobias started the quote in his talk, in his recent interview with America, he explained, "Sometimes I try not to specify so as not to offend, and rather to condemn in general, although it is well known who I am condemning. It is not necessary that I put a name and surname." But I would respond, but if it is well known who is being condemned, what purpose does the silence serve other than muddying the waters? But more importantly, I think, Francis has made some questionable claims about the causes or the origins of the war. So in a June interview with La Civiltà Cattolica, he said, "We need to move away from the usual Little Red Riding Hood pattern in that Little Red Riding Hood was good and the wolf was the bad one." He then cites an unnamed head of state who had told him, "NATO are barking at the gates of Russia. They don't understand that the Russians are imperial and can't have any foreign power getting close to them." And then the Pope adds, "We do not see the whole drama unfolding behind this war, which was perhaps somehow either provoked or not prevented." So he goes on to deny that this implies support for Putin. And he goes on, "I am simply against reducing complexity to the distinction between good and evil without thinking about the roots and interests, which are very complex." So these comments brought to my mind the American Jesuit theologian John Courtney Murray's criticisms of the Christian realists like Reinhold Niebuhr, who Murray calls the ambiguists. Murray wrote, this is a quote, "The ambiguous rightly puts emphasis on the complexity of the situations with which foreign policy has to deal. But does the fact of complexity justify the vocabulary and the monotonous moral verdict of ambiguity? Murray's point here is that political complexity does not necessarily preclude moral clarity if we reason carefully. At least since the pontificate of John Paul II, the Vatican has adopted the view that violent conflict results from spiraling hostilities caused by aggressions, misunderstandings, and self-interest. And there's a great deal of truth in this approach, but it can also lead to its own morally simplistic judgments just as much as the Little Red Riding Hood and Big Bad Wolf approach can. Namely, something along the lines of what we in the United States might call both sidesism. Again, quoting Murray, "He who relishes in irony should relish this, that the whole complicated argument against simplistic theories should result in the end in the creation of a theory that is itself simplistic. Quote, an opposite illusion that is marshy and murky, but no less an illusion." Ironically, it is when Pope Francis makes the clearest moral judgments about the situation in Ukraine that he reveals the greater moral complexity and nuance in the world, compared to some of the more one-sided remarks he has made in the past. So, for example, in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, Francis cast doubt on the entire just war tradition, as expressed in the Catechism, even the right to self-defense, noting using a skepticism worthy of Niebuhr about the ways the just war doctrine can be abused. Yet Francis now, this year, recognizes that the legitimate right of the Ukrainians to take up arms in self-defense, which is actually a nuancing of his position now when faced with the marshy and murky realities of world politics. And then perhaps even more surprisingly, in September, my jaw dropped with this, Francis expressed support of foreign nations supplying arms to Ukraine, quote, if it is done under conditions of morality, in contrast to statements from earlier in his papacy, where he had condemned the arms trade as a trade in money drenched in blood, and he calls for the end of the arms trade. So now he recognizes that under the right circumstances, trading in arms can be justified. So Francis takes these more nuanced positions, and so we can see the wisdom in Murray's view that with careful moral reasoning, we can balance complexity with moral clarity while avoiding moral ambiguities and simplicities that can come from a certain kind of neutrality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. That's very helpful. May I remind our listeners that if you would like to submit some questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. We look forward to hearing from you. In the meantime, we're going to have a little bit of a exchange among our panelists, and maybe I could get us started there by asking, it seems to me that in recent years, the Catholic Church leadership, popes and bishops and so forth, have been inclined to be more skeptical about the use of armed force than they were in earlier years. And indeed, we heard just now from Matthew Shadle about how the Pope Francis has raised questions even about the entire just war tradition in his most recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti. But it seems to me that his move more recently to legitimate the use of armed force in Ukraine is moving in a different direction. So I'd like to hear from the panelists whether you think that there's an evolution of Catholic thought on war and its relationship to nonviolence and peace that's underway, and where do you think that the Ukraine crisis is going to move the Church's understanding of its response to war compared to where, say, the evolution has been moving more toward a commitment to avoiding war? Now, this new situation is opening up the possibility of self-defense as the legitimation of war. Is this carrying us in a somewhat different direction, do you think? I'd invite the panelists to comment on that or other perspectives they'd like to bring. Marianne Cusimano-Love. Yes, please.
Thanks, David. I think it's a great question. And I have a little bit of a different wrinkle in the way I look at this. From the beginning, the Catholic Church has had the tradition of nonviolence, later developed the tradition of just war tradition, and both of those are ensconced in the Catholic Catechism. But what I see as the evolution is really to put greater emphasis on what's been there all along, kind of hiding in plain sight, which is this just peace tradition, how to build a more robust, sustainable peace. And so just war tradition tells you how to limit violence. It doesn't tell you about how to build peace. And so we've seen more emphasis as we've seen greater success in peace building around the world. And as the Church has been part of that story of peace building around the world, we've seen greater emphasis on the active work in peace building. Which takes place long before conflict ever is in the wings and continues throughout all phases of violent conflict. But I think the Church has tried to hold that in tension, and that's been to the frustration of some in the church who want the church to get rid of the just war tradition, to jettison it, and to just hold to a tradition of nonviolence. And the church has not done that. So I read Fratelli Tutti a little differently in that footnote that was referenced as saying, in practice, most of the world's wars have not been just. And that is just a factual statement, not really a criticism of the tradition, but a factual statement. And so what's different about Ukraine is that it's the first time in a very long time that you have a candidate that you really can make just war tradition claims that it meets these elements of just war tradition. So I think what we see is the church trying to hold those both things together. That there may, in my own position, is just war tradition is necessary to limit violence, but it is not alone enough that you need to have the just peace tradition to be able to build more sustainable peace.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Professor Reginbogin has his hand raised, and would you like to make a comment on these issues?
Yes. First, the Vatican has been recognized as a state by the court case of Lateran versus the United States in 2008. And it was because the Justice Department of US had declared that there was no jurisdiction for the Vatican to be criminally or civil, to be charged with any liabilities. So it's not a pre-state, it is a state. And what that means, it has responsibilities like other states, including the international law conventions. So it's not just as if no states have moral obligations. They all have moral obligations. And they are anchored in canon law and in international law, because that is where the community as a world community has accepted without reservations conventions, from Genocide Convention, from Geneva Conventions. And why is international humanitarian law now all on the table? Because it's a very young doctrine of laws, because it's about the proportionality of force, the international law, the different technologies. It's a revolutionary world we're living in, contrasted to others. And that's why the whole scripture of the human dignity, the whole idea that you can condemn, even Oppenheim in the great works that were written on neutrality, which were not pursued because of how World War II began, and the United States was a neutral country, has been suspended. We do not have a clear understanding of the concept of neutrality in this discourse, nor of permanent neutrality and what it means in terms of the international law. And furthermore, what's most important is that this binary thought of just and unjust serves human righteousness. And it is better to understand that an inclusiveness of a family is there to understand and help others to find what Marianne has clearly said is building peace, something which is totally unknown to many different parts of the world. Building peace is something different than what was a part of centuries' dichotomy of just and unjust war.
Thank you very much, Herbert. Suzanne Brown Fleming has a question she would like to raise, or an observation, a point she would like to bring into our discussion. So Suzanne, please.
I look at this a little bit from the practical side. At a time when the majority of Catholics were in the global north, most wars involving Catholics were on European soil, and the tragedies of war were right in front of so many European Catholics. And this is true certainly in the 20th century, the absolute devastation of World War I, the destruction of World War II. I think after World War II, on European soil, we have not seen something like what's happening in Ukraine. with the exception, with only one exception that I can think of in between. So I think for many Europeans and European Catholics, they're watching war again on their own, close to home, if you will. And I think that's something that's making a difference in how everyone is thinking about it.
Thank you. Tobias Winwright, would you like to get into the discussion a little further?
Thank you, everyone. Marianne, I appreciate your words. I would just say Augustine and others way back, they emphasized the tell us our goal of a just war. The right intent is a just peace and actually ultimately reconciliation of the enemy. So although the just war tradition did not devote as much attention to that, recent work on use post bellum, as well as prior to it, to try to prevent war in the first place, it's there. So it's very compatible with the just peace efforts. So I'm in agreement with you on that. And I would just add that this semester I've taught a graduate level seminar on war and peace, and 13 graduate students and their PhD students, 7 of whom are from India, Mexico, and Africa. And the African ones, they all say they're all priests, and none of them have actually ever learned either just war theory or just peacemaking or nonviolence. And some of them are returning home to conflict areas right now, and they think that their only options are passivity and pacifism, which is not necessarily the same, or all-out violence. And so learning the tradition has been they've been appreciating it, that there's this moral reasoning that Matt Shadle pointed out about how to avoid the ambiguity or the passivity, and actually to work our way through that. So, I'm learning a lot from my students from the global South, and they actually are hungry for more clarity on the morality of war and peace.
Matthew Shadle, would you like to raise? I see you have your hand up there. You need to unmute.
Do I have time to pose a question to my peers, or are we running short?
Sure, raise a question if you would like.
Something I wanted to address if I had more time, so I'll just pose it as a question, is, Massimo raised how there's been a shift in Francis's rhetoric as the war has gone on, but he has a couple of times made statements to Ukraine that they need to be ready to sit at the table and negotiate. And some people have bristled at that, we're not gonna, negotiate what is justly ours. But I kind of agree with Francis here. So my question is the Vatican's approach, if it may have fumbled a few things so far, is it actually going to be helpful in bringing this to an end? Right, because that we haven't really talked about that, but like, how does the Vatican diplomatic approach contribute to bringing this conflict to an end? I'd just like to hear what others thought about that.
Very interesting, important question. Piotr Kazicki, you wanted to raise a question as well.
Yeah, thank you. What a fascinating discussion. I mean, I actually will tack right on to the question Matt Shadle just posed. But I want to add a historical component. I'm a historian. I think partly that something that's bothered me about the global dimension in the context of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine is, of course, there is a practical point to be made about how the rest of the world is included. I was thinking that when Tobias was speaking a moment ago, what about the global supply chain disruption? What about the practical consequences for global hunger? There's a multifactorial problem in play here, which strikes me. Okay, if we were in 1967 and we were debating Populorum Progressio in the Holy See of Paul VI, we could ask some of the same questions, but the logistics and the infrastructure have changed. And I think that historical change maybe adds another layer to the conversation, because I am tempted, and I'm glad Massimo has his hand up, because I wanted to ask more about what a post-Cold War looks like that is different, because that's something with which I'm wrestling as a historian and just, I mean, in my own thinking about the church. And I feel like it has to involve this kind of humanistic approach to thinking through, you know, the civilian population, since total war is part of the game one way or the other, in a way that involves more just sovereign Ukrainian soil. But that's just an immediate thought, and I'm very much enjoying this discussion.
Massimo, you wanted to comment?
Right. One short answer to those who just spoke, to Piotr. So I think that the Cold War framework is dangerous and not useful, because I think that many times when Pope Francis talks about Russia or the United States, he adopts a Cold War framework, unconsciously maybe, but this is not the world we live in. It is way too simple to look at the world this way. To answer to Matthew, I think that so there has been a macro shift from before the summer to after the summer, but there has been another intermediate shift, because in September and early October, there were a few attempts coming from some ecclesial leaders, ecclesial lay leaders, with a public platform to advance this idea that peace in Ukraine is possible only at the sacrifice of some sovereignty. At the event that took place in Rome at the end of October, where the president of the Italian Republic, Sergio Mattarella, and of the French Republic, Emmanuel Macron, were invited, and they spoke, they, in very clear, even if in very diplomatic terms, they said, this is not possible. So here, I think that the Vatican is going through a learning process, that there has to be an international process of dialogue. And that's why they have mentioned so many times in these couple of months, the spirit of Helsinki, because this is what they are trying to restore, and the idea that we can convince Ukrainians to give up some of their territory is no longer something that they are saying, not even in coded terms, which is what we have seen in the summer and until September, early October.
I see that Marshal Breger would like to raise an issue. You need to unmute yourself, Marshal.
I've unmuted myself.
Okay, good.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on a point that Suzanne raised, and I have to say it's an area that I'm not an expert in, but in my reading for the question of just war in the Ukraine, I noticed that American and European theologians, I won't say almost to a man or woman, but very, very, very strongly supported the idea that this Ukraine was a just war situation. At the same time, Latin American and African theologians were much less strong in doing so, and some even said it's not. And I don't know if this goes to the global north and global south, if it goes to the point that someone raised earlier, that there's a view that perhaps the Ukraine and NATO may have been responsible for causing the war, if it's the notion of proportionality, the notion that if you're going to lose, which people thought Ukraine would earlier on, if you're going to lose, why have all this destruction? But I'd really be interested in the sort of contextualizing the approach just war in the Ukraine between the global north and global south.
May I raise one point from a question from the audience? I would like to bring that into play because we have some questions from the audience here. One of the questions raised is whether or not the way in which the churches move back and forth on this issue in Ukraine shows that the church is in somehow irrelevant to this whole discussion, that it's been on both sides back and forth. And I think that raises an interesting question about whether neutrality can be compatible with some kind of creative contribution to the political sphere. I wonder whether any of our panelists would like to comment on that, responding to this question from one of the members of our audience about the possible neutrality implying irrelevance to political situations. Any response to that?
Response to the question about Helsinki. Helsinki Accord was created by neutrals. The neutrals were the ones who brought about the Helsinki Accord in the Cold War. And it is exactly that understanding of the historical role of the neutrals in the post-Cold War, which is highly undeveloped. Only recently, 6 months ago, first book of its kind was published. And it's in this new world order of the Cold War or post-Cold War security that the whole idea that moral values and interests are not prioritized or separated. You're not bankrolling any longer the purchases of hydrocarbons so that Russia can continue its horrific destruction of Ukraine. It is a resetting of our entire world order of trade and economics and the moral values between trade and values or interests and values. This is an important part of a new security architecture led by the United States. And it's also being partnered now with the allies. But the most important part of this entire architecture is that when you are asking, is this a just war? The question is more, what can we do to end the war? Not by just looking for the rationale, am I doing good or bad or evil? But rather, how do we contribute together to bring this to an end as a community for the sake of the human dignity? These are different types of questions than being harnessed into this kind of century-long thinking.
Thank you very much. And we're at the end of our time, I'm afraid. But what has just been stated suggests that our task, of course, in regard to the conflict like the Ukraine, would be to develop ways of preventing conflicts of this sort from emerging in the first place, which is what Marianne Cusimano-Love was speaking about in terms of peace building, but also about how we can find a way to bring the concurrent terrible conflict to a conclusion, and what role neutral powers and others that are not involved in the conflict can play in being peacemakers to bring the war to an end. So it seems to me that those would be some very important goals from the thinking from Catholic social thinking that would be in play. So I'm afraid we have to bring our discussion to a conclusion because we're out of time. And I would want to thank all of the participants in this event. I tell our audience that this discussion is recorded and will be posted on the Berkeley Center website in a short time, in a day or so. But again, I want to thank everyone for the very lively participation and for the important contributions to our thinking about what's a very important and very tragic scene on the scene of the world stage today about Ukraine, but also the deeper historical issues that we have explored in seeing what Vatican permanent neutrality might mean in the past, in the present, and in the future. So thanks to all of you, and goodbye.